Episode 16, The Caine Mutiny. The For Legal English podcast is now in session. On today's docket, we discuss the classic movie Caine Mutiny. This movie is about a warship in the Pacific during World War II. The officers of the ship begin to think the captain is not mentally fit to command, in other words, is going crazy, and it comes to a head during a typhoon, where the second in command relieves the captain of command to prevent the ship from foundering during the storm. Once the storm is over and they return to port, he faces a court-martial for mutiny. This is an ongoing series we have featuring some of the best legal movies. We will examine the law demonstrated in the movie and what can lawyers or law students learn from this movie, as well as the entertainment aspect. Welcome to the For Legal English podcast. This is the show for lawyers, law students, and other professionals from all over the world who want to improve both their legal English and legal knowledge. In this podcast, we discuss different legal topics such as the law in the news, law in practice, legal writing, legal movies, and other issues. I'm Timothy Barrett, your host. I'm a former practicing attorney from the United States and now teach law in Tbilisi, Georgia. Go to our website for Legal English, no spaces or dashes.com. That's forlegalenglish.com. Check out our blog articles, available courses, and the show notes for this episode. On the docket today, episode 16, The Caine Mutiny. Stay tuned to the end to hear about the related online quiz, or go to the website to learn more. The film. The Caine Mutiny is a film from 1954. It was directed by Edward Dmytryk. Humphrey Bogart, who was probably one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood at the time, plays Captain Queeg. And it's kind of a unique role for him because it's not really the leading man. He's the captain of the ship, and no one really likes him, and he looks like he's going crazy. So it's an interesting role for him to take. You also have Van Johnson, Fred McMurray, Jose Ferrer, and even some other up-and-coming stars, Lee Marvin and E.G. Marshall, in smaller roles. This is based on a book by Herman Wouk, who himself was in the Navy during World War II. So the book and the movie are both cited by many naval experts from the time as being pretty realistic. Of course, there wasn't a mutiny, but the other aspects are pretty realistic. Obviously, the writer had been there, knew what that life was like. In addition to the book and the movie, there was also a Caine Mutiny court-martial, which became a play. It was a play on Broadway for several years, and this focused on pretty much the second half of the book or second half of the movie, just the court-martial itself. In brief, this movie is about a World War II destroyer minesweeper in the Pacific. And it's kind of in the backwater Navy. It's dirty, it's not very exciting, it's not a flashy destroyer minesweeper, where they're kind of having to do the dirty jobs, and it's not glamorous or thrilling. We see a lot of the movie through the eyes of a new ensign just commissioned and assigned to this ship. And at first he's very disappointed to be assigned to this type of ship. He's not really impressed with the ship or the captain. The captain is kind of lackadaisical, very laid back, but soon that captain is replaced. He leaves the ship, and then a new captain takes over. And that captain, of course, is Captain Queeg, played by Humphrey Bogart. And then the officers of the ship begin to think that the captain is kind of going crazy and start talking about, should he be relieved? Should they forcibly take command from him? This kind of goes back and forth. They discuss it. They watch how he behaves. They notice some strange behavior. But then it comes to a head during a typhoon, a very severe tropical storm, where the executive officer, the XO, or the second in command, Lieutenant Merrick, played by Van Johnson, relieves the captain. And subsequently, there's the trial for mutiny. My thoughts? This is a pretty good movie, both for the law aspects and the entertainment part of it. It's a court-martial, which is a slightly different trial. We get to see a great cross-examination. We'll discuss more in detail later. And it's interesting to see when a defense attorney doesn't always agree with his client. What duty does that defense attorney have? This is also a great movie for discussing naval leadership or any type of military leadership or any leadership at all, to think about what a captain should do or not do, or what the officers supporting the captain should do or should not do. I always thought this movie was somewhat similar to Mr. Roberts, which is another movie from around the same time concerning another backwater Navy ship in World War II Pacific. That one was with Henry Fonda and James Cagney, although there's no court-martial or much law aspect in the movie, but both of these movies, Mr. Roberts and the Caine Mutiny, are great to watch from a leadership perspective. The captain. It's important to remember that the captain of a ship is a very important and very powerful person. And it's often been described as he's second only to God. He has a tremendous amount of responsibility. And I will say he, because in the World War II Navy, there was only men, of course. It may not be that way today, but back then it certainly was. And like a judge, a captain has a wide amount of discretion. Things that he does may seem unfair or even crazy to those on board, but what would others, outsiders, or the admiral think of these complaints? Normally, they would view them from a perspective of protecting the captain or trusting the captain much more than those who are complaining. In the beginning of the movie, they point out that there has never been a mutiny on a U.S. Navy ship, but this movie is kind of about what if that happened. If you are interested in more about mutinies, or especially in the U.S. Navy, another good movie is Crimson Tide with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, which talks about that more directly, also throwing in nuclear war into the mix as well. Captain Queeg has been in the Navy for several years. He was in the Navy before the war started. And we don't know exactly what he was doing during the war, but it's obvious to see that he had a pretty stressful time during the war. You can see some of the after effects. He has been promoted during that time. I believe that this is his first command, so it's the first time he's the captain of a ship, but has a long record of sea service. And the captain is not very sympathetic to the officers. And I think it's often difficult for a new captain to come in where the ship is already in existence. He's the only new person in this ship. It's obvious that all of the officers and crew, maybe with the exception of that ensign, really liked the old captain, which makes it even more difficult. Over time, the officers noticed kind of a pattern of psychotic behavior. And of course, it all comes to head during that typhoon, which we'll talk about directly. The mutiny. So the executive officer, the second in command, also known as the XO, relieves the captain during this storm, during this typhoon. The captain wanted to maintain the course set by the fleet before the storm began. Unfortunately, this was in a direction where it was kind of going at an angle towards the storm. So because of that, and because the waves were getting bigger and bigger, there's a real risk that it might capsize, or at least that's what the executive officer and others thought. So the XO argued that they had to turn into the wind, otherwise the ship would founder, would capsize. The ship would be lost. Later, we find out that there were, in fact, 3 ships of the fleet that were lost during the storm. So it seemed to be a very serious storm. The captain kind of seems out of it, so the XO orders the ship to change course towards what he thinks is a safer direction. And then the captain kind of comes back to his senses and then argues with the XO, and eventually the XO formally relieves the captain under the Articles of Naval Regulations. The law. So at this point, in 1944, in the middle of World War II, remember the United States enters World War II in the end of 1941, and the war with Japan goes on until August of 1945. So this is 1944. And the naval law was commonly called the Rocks and Shoals. After World War II, In the reorganization of the Defense Department, or what became the Defense Department, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, was introduced. The UCMJ is the standardized criminal code, as well as a little bit more than that, but it's standardized criminal code for the United States Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the newly formed Air Force. Until that time, the Navy had their own regulations, which included the Marine Corps, and the Army had their own regulations, which did cause some problems if you had a sailor attached to an Army unit or vice versa, because the now different rules might apply that they're unfamiliar with. According to the Rocks and Shoals, if you have a court-martial, there's a board of 7 officers. So it's not really a jury. Under the UCMJ, there would be a jury, but at this time, there was more of a board. But who does the Navy trust to determine the best course for the ship to take during the typhoon? The prosecutor brings this up during the court-martial. The captain has several years of experience. He is the captain. So this is a tough presumption to overcome for this executive officer. And the board is usually composed of senior officers who are ship captains within the same fleet. So in other words, they are other captains deciding the case. You have to realize that in the back of their mind, they might also be thinking, do they want other XOs or junior officers to contemplate relieving other captains? Is this a decision, an action that's going to be ratified by the Navy or condemned and punished by the Navy? The defense attorney. So Lieutenant Barney Greenwald is the defense attorney, played by Jose Ferrer, who does an excellent job playing this character. He has a very large presence in every scene that he's in. They don't explain it, but I believe he's an injured pilot. This is based on, he's got a different uniform that the pilots in the Navy would wear. He's also got an obvious hurt hand. So it appears that he's probably a naval pilot who before the war was a lawyer. He's probably on light duty because of his injury. Maybe he's working at the JAG office, the Judge Advocate General office, while he heals up from the injury. The first time we see him, he meets with Lieutenant Kiefer to decide if he should take the case or not. And I think this is somewhat realistic. Who wants to defend mutineers? I'm reminded of a real case in military law where a Marine JAG officer impersonated a lawyer for several years. So he was a lawyer within the Marine Corps, but in actuality, he was not a qualified lawyer. He was not a member of the bar. So when that came out, of course, he himself was court-martialed. And who defended him? Another Marine JAG officer? No, it was an Air Force JAG officer. They couldn't find, or they would rather have someone kind of outside of the Marine Corps defend this person. I think that certainly there are some crimes. This is not a normal crime, after all. Kiefer is accused of mutiny, which, as we've already discussed, has never happened in the United States Navy. So this is kind of a big deal. Some great dialogue at the end of the scene. Lieutenant asks the lawyer, "Will you take the case?" And Lieutenant Greenwald replies, "I would much rather prosecute." It's clear that Lieutenant Greenwald doesn't really like this situation. He's kind of not comfortable with it. But, of course, he believes that he is entitled to counsel, to a competent defense. And it's interesting to try to wonder, does the defense attorney, Lieutenant Greenwald, think that Lieutenant Kiefer did the right thing? Did he save the ship? In my own opinion, I think that he does. If he didn't think that, I'm not sure that Lieutenant Greenwald would have taken the case. But who knows? If you're enjoying today's episode, please subscribe, give us 5 stars, and a review. You can also go to our website, 4 is in the number 4, Legal English, no spaces or dashes.com. That's 4legalenglish.com. Check out our blog articles, available courses, and the show notes for this episode. You can also comment. This is a great way to practice and improve your legal English skills. If you're looking to improve those legal English skills, consider our Elemental Legal English course. This is our flagship course, which introduces you to a lot of the important legal English terms. This is completely online, and you can complete it at your own pace. This is based on a university semester-length course. The course includes video lectures with me, Timothy Barrett, quizzes to reinforce and test your knowledge from the lessons, a downloadable lexicon workbook to complete as you complete the course, flashcards with every chapter, an excerpt from a court case, a landmark decision, with a discussion and questions about that case. And each chapter has blocks on grammar and idioms, as well as a chapter end test. If you're looking to improve your legal English skills, this is a great way to do it. You can check it out at our website, forlegalenglish.com, and look for the Elemental Legal English course. The false friend. So in language, a lot of times we use this term false friend, meaning a word that is familiar to you. Maybe it's the same, for example, in English as your native language, but it doesn't actually mean the same thing. Maybe it means something completely different. So it is known as a false friend. You try to rely on it, but it will let you down. And Lieutenant Kiefer, played brilliantly by Fred McMurray, was definitely a false friend. He was the chief instigator, trying to kind of get the other officers to realize the captain is a danger and they have to do something about him. At one point, he gets the XO and Ensign Keith to go to the Admiral, Admiral Halsey, on his aircraft carrier. But just before they go into the Admiral's office and discuss what's going on the Caine, Lieutenant Kiefer bails on them, says, "Oh, what are we doing here? The Admiral isn't going to see it the same way we see it. I'm out of here." Leaving the XO to kind of make the decision, go in just by himself or with the ensign, without having this other lieutenant that would give him a lot of credibility, as well as be able to explain it a little bit better. It was Lieutenant Kiefer who first brings up this particular article, which concerns relieving the captain of duty, after all. And during the relief of command on the bridge during the typhoon, he's sure not to actively take part in it. He wasn't on the bridge at the time, but even after the fact, when they're called to the bridge, he doesn't really comment anything. He doesn't say anything. He's quick to leave. Then during the court-martial, he appears to lie on the stand. He doesn't want to implicate himself. At that point, he realizes that he could be court-martialed too, because he kind of counseled Lieutenant Merrick. He encouraged Lieutenant Merrick to take these actions. And because of that, he is open to criminal liability as well, kind of conspiracy to commit mutiny. And when he lies on the stand, the defense attorney does not harp on that. He does not bring up the fact that he's lying, doesn't point it out to the court, because it doesn't help his case. Lieutenant Greenwald says he wants one hero, not another mutineer. Asking some further questions, bringing up some further testimony, he would be able to discredit Lieutenant Kiefer on the stand. However, that doesn't help his client. It doesn't help Lieutenant Merrick, who is the defendant in the court-martial. Mental health. It's interesting, there's lots of mental health terms that are used in the movie. Paranoia, psychotic, mental illness, schizophrenia. In the 21st century, these are commonly discussed terms and somewhat understood. I would argue that most people don't have an advanced knowledge of these terms, but we at least kind of understand what they mean and what the implications are. These are common household terms nowadays. Even if they do mean something specific that most people might not have a full grasp of, we have a general idea of what they mean, certainly. But this was the 1940s. And I think these terms were not nearly as well known or well recognized. And Lieutenant Kiefer, Fred McMurray's character, talks about it, but the other officers really had never heard these terms before. And this comes up before the court-martial and even during the court-martial. The court-martial. So the court-martial is a little bit different than a normal civilian criminal trial, but it does have a lot of similarities. We can see that the witnesses are usually waiting outside the courtroom and they can't talk to each other. I mean, they can say good morning, things like that, but they're ordered not to discuss the case, what happens in the room. So when one witness is called in, he'll go in, testify, and leave, but he can't see what other witnesses testify to and can't discuss it with the other witnesses. So probably all of the other officers on board the Caine were called as witnesses, and some of the sailors were called as well, but they only know what they testified to, questions that they were asked. They don't know the testimony of other witnesses. The board itself is made up of 7 senior naval officers, probably 7 captains from other ships within that fleet. So the board has one long table kind of in the center of the room, perpendicular to and on either side of that big table, you have the smaller prosecutor's table and the defense table. In the middle, you have a witness chair. Next to the witness chair, you have a stenographer who's recording what anyone says during the proceedings. And during the court-martial, you can see that everyone has a respect for sea duty, for sailors or officers who spent a lot of time at sea. It comes up with Captain Queeg, of course, but also there's a petty officer, a sailor, who the prosecutor tries to cut down. You're not an officer. What does he know? But the defense attorney brings up, well, what's that on your uniform? What do those stars mean? And the petty officer says, well, this star is for this star is for that. And it turns out he's served in 4 major campaigns, which very well might be more than any of the other officers that are in the room. They kind of respect that service, that experience. And almost the opposite for Ensign Keith or the doctor who's a psychiatrist. Ensign Keith is still new to the Navy. The doctor, although is a very experienced doctor, is new to the Navy as well and has not served at sea. He's not used to examining ship captains, although he does have experience from his civil practice dealing with CEOs, other important executives, but not naval captains. Another thing that's kind of unique for the court-martial is before the defense attorney cross-examines the Captain Queeg, they warn the defense attorney he must not disrespect the captain, who's a superior officer. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that you have this lieutenant who has dual responsibilities. One, to his client. He's an attorney, must give a zealous defense for his client. But he's also a naval officer himself. He has to respect a superior officer. He doesn't want to get in trouble himself. It's interesting, one of the lines that he says towards the end is, quote, "I say it's up to you line naval officers, not doctors, to judge the captain's performance of duty," unquote. Basically saying to the board members, the captains that are on the court-martial board, it's up to them to determine, not relying on this doctor. We're naval officers. It's you to make the decision, not a psychiatrist, not this outsider. He's kind of making that argument. The cross-examination. And I think this is the highlight of the film. This is a great cross-examination scene. When a witness is called, the party that calls the witness does direct examination. So in this case, Captain Queeg was called by the prosecution, so the prosecutor conducts direct examination. At the end of that examination, it's the defense attorney or the other party's opportunity to give cross-examination. And the opposite would be true when the defense attorney calls a witness. Prosecution ends their case, the defense attorney calls one of their witnesses, they would give direct examination. Now the prosecutor gets a chance to cross-examine that defense witness. Cross-examination can be much more powerful than direct examination for a couple of reasons. One, you have more leeway to ask questions. You can ask leading questions. On direct examination, as a prosecutor, I had this experience many, many times where you have to ask open-ended questions. What did you see? What happened next? Kind of those broad questions. Whereas on cross-examination, you can ask, you saw him there, didn't you? You saw what he was doing. You saw him have a gun in his hand. You saw him have a knife in his hand. You saw him say whatever to the victim, didn't you? So you can ask these kind of leading questions. Often they have a yes or no response, yes or no answer. And so it's much more interesting to watch. It's much easier to get answers out of the witness. And of course, if you're on cross-examination and you can get that witness, that opposing side's witness, to give you good evidence, then that's even more powerful. If you're on the board of inquiry or if you're on the jury and you hear a witness called by one side, they give evidence supporting that side, but then you hear them give even more evidence supporting the other side that did not call that witness. That's probably more convincing evidence. So cross-examination can be very powerful. As a prosecutor, you normally don't get a chance to do much cross-examination. One of the highlights of my trial experience was when I got to cross-examine a burglary defendant. He testified on direct examination, and then I got to give a cross-examination of him. And it was probably the best examination I gave as a as a lawyer. It was tremendous. I was asking a lot of good questions, very leading questions, and got the defendant to make a lot of admissions. And I think that's convinced the jury to vote guilty in that case. So like I said, the cross-examination of Captain Queeg is one of the highlights of the film, one of the best scenes. At the very beginning, especially during direct examination, Captain Queeg appears to be brave and kind of a maligned commanding officer, surrounded by either incompetence or other officers not supporting him. But by the end of cross-examination, it's clear he had mental issues, probably caused by combat stress. In the past, they would call this shell shock or battle fatigue. In the 21st century, we often call it post-traumatic stress disorder. At one point, Captain Queeg goes off. He kind of goes off on a tangent and, in response to these questions, and he goes too far. Eventually, he realizes he went too far, and he goes silent, but then there's silence in the room entirely. The board, even the prosecutor, realize that Captain Queeg is a bit crazy. And like I said, probably because of combat stress, but now they can kind of see, well, maybe it wasn't a mutiny. Maybe Lieutenant Merrick did have the best interest of the ship at heart. And this scene was later reimagined in the movie A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. And it was a very good scene in that movie, but I would argue it's not nearly as good a movie as this one is, the Caine Mutiny. But that cross-examination scene with Jack Nicholson is another great scene. The after party. So after the trial is over, Lieutenant Merrick is acquitted. We see the officers of the Caine, of course not with the captain, but the rest of the officers having kind of a private party at a very fancy room. The defense attorney comes in, Lieutenant Greenwald, and gives a monologue. It's obvious that he's drunk. He had been drinking before he arrived. He says that he feels terrible because he torpedoed a good man, Captain Queeg. So he still thinks that Captain Queeg is a good man. And perhaps he thinks that Captain Queeg should have been relieved at the time, at the time of that typhoon. That was maybe the proper thing to do, but he was a good man and he deserved better. He points out that none of the Caine's officers supported the captain. They tried to undermine him. And Lieutenant Greenwald points out Captain Queeg was the best officer on the Caine, despite his mental problems. Certainly deserved better from his officers, who should have supported him more. And if they had, then it wouldn't have gotten to the point during that typhoon that he needed to be relieved. He goes so far as to throw a drink in Lieutenant Kiefer's face, the false friend, and then says, quote, "If you want to do anything about it, I will be outside. I'm a lot drunker than you are, so it'll be a fair fight," close quote, which is another good quote from Lieutenant Greenwald. I think Lieutenant Greenwald is probably the strongest character in the movie, or it comes off the best. Online quiz. So starting with this episode, we're going to offer an online quiz to complement the episode. For this quiz, you may want to watch the movie before taking the quiz. There'll be some questions from things that we discussed during this episode, but maybe there'll be one or two from the movie itself. So please check out the movie. You can go to the website and see the blog article for this quiz, or just look at the show notes for this episode, episode 15. Terms. So here are some legal terms that we discussed in the episode today. Court-martial, mutiny, mutineer, cross-examination, Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ. What can we as lawyers learn from this movie? I think duty to client. Lieutenant Greenwald, played by Jose Ferrer, he defended his client, even though it meant attacking a good man. Also, cross-examination. Like I said, that was probably the highlight of the court scenes. As a film, how entertaining is this? I would say entertaining. I encourage you to watch this, especially the court-martial, which is the second half of the film. Like I said earlier, this is a great study of leadership, of naval leadership, but really in any context. What should those officers have done? Was the defense attorney right? If the officers had supported the captain more in the beginning, would this all have been avoided? Is this how the other officers should have treated this combat veteran who is now the captain of their ship? Did they owe him a little bit more respect and loyalty. What questions do you have about the Caine Mutiny? Did you understand the legal topics discussed? What did you think of the outcome? Should he have been acquitted? So please subscribe, give us 5 stars and a review. Go to our website, 4 is in the number 4, Legal English, no spaces or dashes.com. You can check out our blog articles, available courses, and the show notes for this episode, and also see the online quiz. You can comment. It's a great way to practice and improve your legal English skills. The For Legal English podcast is adjourned. Don't miss the next docket call.